I was halfway to the trash bins with a bag full of diapers when I heard it. A muffled whimper that didn't belong to a raccoon or stray animal. I paused. There it was again, barely audible, but it sent a bolt of ice through my spine. I dropped the bag and sprinted toward the dumpster behind our HOA-managed community park. And there, curled up in the corner of the bin like discarded furniture, was my 5-year-old son Luke, his Spider-Man hoodie stained with something dark, maybe juice or worse, and his tiny hands trembling as he held onto a piece of chalk like it was his last lifeline. I yanked him out, heart slamming against my ribs, and the first words out of his mouth shattered every ounce of self-control I had. The man in the shiny vest said I was trash. Luke wasn't supposed to be outside alone. I had only left him for a minute while grabbing the garbage. He'd been chalk drawing on the walkway beside our unit, where he loved to sketch superheroes battling monsters. I scanned the area, pulse racing, eyes darting for movement. I knew who this shiny vest man was before Luke even finished his sentence. Doug, the HOA's self-appointed enforcer who strutted through the community like a mall cop with a god complex. Luke kept crying, confused, cheeks streaked with dirt and fear. He clutched his sketch pad like it was armor. I crouched down, kissed his forehead, and whispered that he was safe now. But I wasn't calm. Not even close. I was a dormant volcano that just remembered how to erupt. I carried Luke inside and cleaned him up, all the while biting my tongue so hard I tasted blood. My hands moved automatically. Warm water, soft towel, favorite cartoon bandages. But my mind was a cyclone of rage. After settling him on the couch with some hot cocoa, I pulled up the porch camera feed from earlier. There he was, Luke swatting on the sidewalk, completely immersed in his chalk masterpiece. Enter Doug, storming in like a medieval guard spotting graffiti on a castle wall. He shouted, pointed, snatched Luke up by the arm, and walked him down the path, scolding him for defacing public property. And then, God help him, he lifted the lid of the dumpster, dropped my son in, and walked away without a backward glance. I stared at the screen, fists clenched so tight my knuckles went white. For most people, this would have been the moment to call the police, maybe a lawyer. But I wasn't most people. I was Territoris, undefeated featherweight MMA champion, until I hung up my gloves to raise Luke. And while I promised myself those days were behind me, promises only go so far when your child is treated like trash. I dialed the HOA's number with hands still shaking, not from fear, but from fury. A peppy assistant named Darla answered. I need to speak with Karen Greaves, the HOA president. I said, my voice deceptively calm. She's in a board session, Darla chirped. May I take a message? I didn't leave a message. I drove. Karen's house was only 5 blocks away, nestled in a gated section of the neighborhood. Ironic, considering she was about to get a front row seat to a storm she had no clue was brewing. When she opened the door, she wore a smile that didn't reach her eyes and a satin robe that screamed inherited money. Oh, Tara, she said, like we were PTA buddies instead of sworn enemies. If this is about the chalk incident, I cut her off. You call dumping a 5-year-old in the trash an incident. She didn't flinch. Well, he was unsupervised and drawing on HOA-maintained walkways. That's technically vandalism. Doug was just enforcing the rules. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I stepped forward. She stepped back. If you ever let that man near my son again, rules won't save you. She scoffed. Is that a threat? I smiled. Not yet. That night, I didn't sleep. Neither did my fists. I spent hours researching state child endangerment laws, reviewing security footage frame by frame, and reading every single HOA regulation line by line. I discovered Doug wasn't just enforcing made-up rules. He was exceeding his authority in ways that left the HOA wide open to liability. But the part that made my blood boil. Luke wasn't the first. There were reports, whispered complaints in Facebook groups, a disabled teen who had his wheelchair ramp blocked for aesthetics, a senior whose bird bath was smashed for non-compliance. No one fought back. Until now. The next day, I took Luke to the park. Yes, the same park with the dumpster. I sat him on a bench with a juice box and a fresh box of chalk. I dared them to come. Doug didn't show, but Karen did, flanked by 2 SMUD board members in matching polos. She tried to look civil, but I saw the tension behind her Botox smile. "I think it's best we discuss this at the next community forum," she said, like this was a zoning issue, not the trauma of a 5-year-old. I reached into my bag and handed her a USB drive. "That's your agenda. Footage of Doug throwing Luke in the trash. It's already backed up in 4 places and scheduled for online release unless your HOA apologizes in writing, fires Doug, and pays for trauma counseling." Her smile twitched. "You wouldn't." "I will," I said, locking eyes, "but I'd much rather settle this the friendly way. You know, before gloves come off." She turned without a word, high heels stabbing into the grass like tiny daggers. I could hear her board members muttering as they walked away. They weren't laughing anymore. That evening, I got an email from the HOA lawyer offering a courtesy mediation session. I ignored it. This wasn't about paperwork or settlement. This was about a line being crossed so hard it snapped in half. They threw my son in a dumpster like a broken toy. They had no idea what they just awakened, because this time the fight wasn't for a title. It was for my kid. And they just stepped into the wrong cage. The next morning was eerily quiet, as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. I walked Luke to the corner, with his backpack bouncing and his tiny hand holding mine a little tighter than usual. He didn't ask to draw with chalk today. That alone told me just how deep the damage ran. He used to beg me to stay outside after school, drawing worlds filled with dragons, ninjas, and superheroes with capes shaped like lightning. Today, he just kept his eyes down and asked if Dut was still around. I bent down, looked him in the eyes, and told him, "Nobody is ever going to hurt you like that again." He nodded slowly, trying to believe me, but trust is a delicate thing, and it had been shattered like cheap glass. After dropping him off at school, I sat in my car outside the gates, engine humming, fingers clenched around the steering wheel. My mind was replaying every second of that video. Doug didn't even hesitate. No remorse, no flinch, no sense of human decency. Just cold enforcement. I knew that HOA would try to downplay it, bury it in legal jargon and community clauses. But they didn't realize who they were dealing with. I'd fought in blood-soaked cages in front of thousands. I'd taken knees to the face and still stood up. I was trained for pressure. But this wasn't about resilience anymore. This was about justice, the kind you make with your own hands when no one else will. That day, I went to the next HOA open forum. I showed up early, sat in the front row, and crossed my legs like a calm mom with nothing on her mind except bake sales. But inside, I was simmering. Karen walked in like royalty, flanked by her usual clique of sun-hatted cronies and smug executives. Her fake politeness didn't fool anyone anymore. The moment she saw me, her mouth twitched like she tasted something sour. She tried to ignore me, but I stood up before she could begin the meeting. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I just calmly asked the group if they thought it was okay for a 5-year-old to be physically thrown in a dumpster. Murmurs rippled through the room. A few residents glanced at one another nervously. Karen tried to regain control by reading from the meeting agenda, but I pulled out my laptop and played the video without saying a word. The sound of Luke crying echoed through the small community hall. A hush fell over everyone. One woman gasped. Another covered her mouth. The video ended, and I closed the laptop. Karen stammered something about context, but I spoke over her, cool and even. No child deserves that. And if you don't remove Dowd from duty and issue a formal apology, I'll make sure every parent in this state sees this clip by sunrise. The board looked at each other, unsure whether to support Karen or save their own reputations. Dut wasn't even there. Coward. Karen promised they would review the footage and take appropriate steps, but I knew that meant delay, spin, and suppression. That was fine. I'd already uploaded the video to multiple cloud backups and created an anonymous Reddit post on r/ entitled People. Within the hour, it started gaining traction. Within 2 hours, it was on the front page. By sunset, my phone was blowing up with media inquiries, podcast invites, and local reporters wanting the scoop. But I didn't want fame. I wanted reform. And more than that, I wanted that HOA to burn down, metaphorically, under the weight of its own arrogance. But I wasn't going to swing wildly. I was going to break them one regulation at a time. The next step was building public support from inside the community. I started visiting neighbors, especially the ones who had been silent victims of HOA harassment. A sweet elderly woman named Ruth told me her garden gnome collection had been seized by Dove for visual pollution. Another man, a retired Marine named Tony, admitted he was fined $300 for having an American flag mounted at a slightly wrong angle. These weren't accidents. They were patterns. I documented every story. I recorded conversations, with permission. I built a digital folder that made the HOA look less like a governing body and more like a petty dictatorship. And every night I returned to my garage, slowly transforming it into a space that felt familiar. Rubber mats, steel bars, sandbags. The gym wasn't ready, but it was coming. Luke loved helping me carry little dumbbells, pretending to be my coach. He was starting to smile again, and every time he did, my purpose sharpened like a blade. Karen, meanwhile, went on damage control. She issued a blanket HOA-wide memo calling the incident a misunderstanding, blaming Dove for unauthorized enforcement, and assuring residents that corrective measures were in progress. But what she didn't realize was that people were done listening. They were watching, and the more she tried to control the narrative, the more cracks formed in her facade. Doug eventually reemerged, knocking on doors and awkwardly apologizing with printed cards that looked like they were made on clip art software from 2003. I confronted him at one such door visit, filming the entire encounter. I asked him on camera if he remembered what Luke was doing before being thrown away. He said, drawing on a sidewalk, which is defacing property. I asked if that justified dumping a child. He shrugged. A shrug. That was all I needed. That video alone sparked outrage across parent forums and neighborhood groups. But the final push came from someone I didn't expect. A teen girl named Cassidy from 3 streets over. She emailed me a clip from 6 months earlier. It showed Dow confronting her for walking her dog off leash and then aggressively grabbing her by the arm. She'd sent it to Karen back then, who ignored it. Now she gave it to me. I uploaded that clip too. That night, I watched as the online firestorm erupted. HOA enforcer assaults teen was the headline across 3 blogs. Then came Mom exposes HOA abuse with dumpster video. It was the perfect storm of community outrage and viral attention. But I wasn't done. I filed the paperwork for a civil lawsuit the next morning. Charges: child endangerment, emotional distress, and negligence. I named both Doug and the HOA board as defendants. I also sent a courtesy copy of the filing directly to Karen's inbox, highlighted in yellow, with a handwritten sticky note that read, "We could have handled this with an apology. Now we'll handle it in court." The moment I dropped the documents off, I didn't feel relief. I felt readiness. Because now it wasn't just my story. It was Ruth's. It was Tony's. It was Cassidy's. And most of all, it was Luke's. The war had officially begun. It took less than 48 hours for the HOA's carefully polished image to fall apart like cheap wallpaper in a thunderstorm. The online posts had exploded beyond even my expectations. I wasn't trying to go viral, but I wasn't going to shy away when it happened either. Emails flooded in from former residents, current members stuck in other HOA-run neighborhoods, even a local news crew that offered to run a segment called Communities in Crisis. But while the internet buzzed, the HOA board tried to act as if it were business as usual. Karen issued another sanitized statement full of empty buzzwords like transparency, leadership, accountability, and rebuilding trust. But she never addressed the actual footage, never mentioned Luke, never even said the word dumpster. That was her biggest mistake. You can lie all you want, but when the public sees a 5-year-old in a trash bin, there's no PR spin that saves you. I turned my focus inward and got to work finishing the garage. I hadn't lifted like this in years, but every motion, the clank of weights, the slap of jump ropes, the rhythm of gloves against leather, brought back something I had locked away. My body hadn't forgotten what it meant to train for war. This wasn't about glory, though. It was about grounding myself, about preparing to lead, not just fight. I bought new gear, laid mats, installed mirrors. I even hand-painted the sign over the door myself. It read, "The Octagon of Justice." I did it half-jokingly at first, but by the time I stepped back and looked at it, I realized it wasn't a joke at all. This wasn't just a gym. It was a message, a challenge. Word spread fast, especially since I didn't charge a dime. I opened the doors to anyone in the community who had ever been bullied, fined, or humiliated by the HOA. First to show up was Ruth, the elderly woman who'd had her nose removed. She didn't want to fight, but she said she'd come by just to feel something stronger than fear again. Then came Tony, the ex-Marine who helped reinforce the ceiling mounts for the punching bags. Before long, I had 6 people training with me daily. We weren't just hitting pads. We were talking, sharing, planning. I listened, they vented, and together we formed something better than a support group. We formed a resistance. Of course, the HOA didn't take this lightly. Karen sent me a formal warning letter within the week, claiming I was operating a commercial gym on residential property. I smiled when I read it, because a few months back, I helped my sister, who just happened to work in the city zoning department, file paperwork converting my garage into a personal recreation and nonprofit activity space under the Community Enrichment Clause. I faxed a copy of that certification back to Karen with a note that read, "See you in yoga class." The silence that followed was golden. Doug, however, wasn't content with silence. Late one evening, he showed up at the gym unannounced, pretending to be inspecting a noise complaint. It was barely 7:30, and we were just stretching when I saw his reflection in the mirror. He walked in like he still had authority, like the world hadn't already turned on him. He was wearing that same reflective vest, clipboard tucked under his arm, eyes scanning the place like he was appraising damage he couldn't prove. I walked right up to him, stopping just a foot from his face. Everyone else froze. He tried to look brave, but I saw the flicker of hesitation. "You're trespassing," I said, keeping my voice level. "I'm within my rights to verify property use," he said, almost bored. "Not anymore. You're not," I replied. "This space is zoned and protected. Also, I have a restraining order in progress. You touch one thing in here, and you're going viral again, Doug." He glanced around like he was realizing, too late, that he had no backup. And then he said something I'll never forget. "You think you're tough just because you used to fight in a cage." I leaned forward slightly and smiled. "No, I think I'm tough because I'm a mother, and I'm standing in my own cage now." He left. He didn't slam the door or shout. He just turned and walked out, the last shred of power crumbling behind him like ash. That week, Karen tried one last desperate move. She scheduled a community safety seminar in the HOA hall and invited every resident. The invitation came with glossy flyers and a message about rebuilding peace and clarifying HOA rules for the benefit of all, or as VP. Yes, I walked in wearing my black compression shirt and jeans, hair tied back, no makeup, no theatrics. The room was packed. Most people weren't sure what to expect. Karen stood at the podium, smug and polished, and opened with a line about misunderstandings being blown out of proportion. I stood up before she finished her sentence. "Would you like me to play the footage again?" I asked, loud enough for everyone to hear. She paused. People turned to me. I could see the panic flicker in her eyes. I didn't need to play anything. The damage had already been done. I just wanted her to feel it. "What happened to my son isn't a misunderstanding," I continued. "It's what happens when people in power forget they serve a community, not control it. You're not leaders. You're cowards with clipboards." Someone in the back clapped, then another. The sound grew until it filled the room like a roar. Karen tried to talk over it, but the tide had already turned. It wasn't my voice alone anymore. The entire neighborhood was rising. Some people shouted that they wanted a vote. Others called for a special session to remove the board. Karen finally snapped, shouting into the microphone that this isn't how governance works. I leaned toward her as I walked past and whispered, It is now. Back home, Luke was waiting for me on the porch. He was drawing again. His new creation showed a stick-figure mom in boxing gloves standing next to a smiling kid. Above them was a sun, and the words, "Mom's house equals safe." He looked up and grinned proudly, pointing at his work. I sat beside him, feeling that familiar fire inside me finally settle into something warm. The HOA thought they could silence us with rules and regulations, but they forgot the most powerful force in any community isn't paperwork, it's people. And this time, the people were done being quiet. The courthouse steps felt different that morning, not because they were worn or wide or flanked by marble lions, but because of who was walking up them. I wasn't just a mom anymore. I wasn't just a fighter or an angry neighbor looking for justice. I was the face of something that had outgrown me. I had become the stand-in voice for everyone who'd been pushed around by people who used rules like weapons and vests like armor. I glanced down at Luke, holding my hand tightly, dressed in his tiny button-up shirt with his cartoon dinosaur tie. He didn't understand everything that was happening, but he knew it mattered. He knew we were going to a place where adults would have to explain why they threw him away like trash, and he wanted to hear them squirm. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with tension. Karen sat at the defense table in a stiff blazer 3 sizes too expensive for her comfort level, her face made of porcelain and pride. Doug was there too, though he refused to look at anyone, his eyes fixed on the tabletop like a student waiting for a scolding. Their lawyer tried to project calm, but the growing stack of evidence we had turned his every sentence into a desperate balancing act. My lawyer, Coach Dante, stood beside me, straight-backed and steady. He wasn't just my former fight coach. After I retired, he'd gone to law school, saying if he couldn't train fighters, he'd train for a different ring. He wasn't the most polished lawyer in the room, but he was the most dangerous. He never raised his voice. He didn't need to. He knew how to strike when it counted. The judge was a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s, quick-witted and impossible to intimidate. She called both parties forward, and the trial began with the facts. Video footage, medical statements, testimonies. What started as a single mother's complaint unraveled into a web of misconduct ranging from harassment to systemic HOA abuse. Ruth came forward first. She told the story of how Doug and Karen trespassed into her backyard and seized her lawn ornaments while she was at a doctor's appointment. She shook as she described the fear that had settled over her every day since, not from physical danger, but from the slow erosion of her dignity. Tony followed, speaking plainly about being fined for flying a flag and the shame he felt when asked to remove it on Memorial Day. He didn't yell. He didn't rage. He just said, "I didn't fight overseas to get bossed around on my own porch." Then Cassidy took the stand. She was nervous at first, her voice small, until she began playing the clip on her phone, the one where Doug grabbed her arm, accused her of being a security threat, and tried to detain her for walking a dog. The judge leaned forward during that part. Karen's lawyer objected, claiming it was unrelated to our case, but the judge allowed it, stating that the pattern of behavior was now clearly relevant. Finally, it was my turn. I stood, heart pounding, not from fear, but from memory. I spoke slowly. I told them about finding Luke in the dumpster, how he had been shaking, crying, calling for me, how the man who threw him in there never thought for 1 second that he'd done something wrong. I told them how my son didn't touch chalk for days, how he asked if he was bad. I kept it together until I described the moment Luke looked at his own drawing and said, "Maybe superheroes aren't real." My voice cracked then, and I didn't try to hide it. I looked the judge in the eye and said, this wasn't just about a rule being broken. It was about a child being broken, and that's something no code of conduct can excuse. Karen took the stand last. She tried to spin it, of course. She blamed Doug, claimed he acted without authorization. She said the HOA was understaffed, overwhelmed, and misunderstood. But when Dante pulled out printed emails, internal communication where Karen had written, "Sometimes these brats need a little scare to keep them in line," everything crumbled. The jury didn't even need to look at me to decide who was telling the truth. Karen's mask cracked as she tried to justify her words. She said it was a joke. I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt. The judge leaned forward and asked, "Do you often joke about putting children in dumpsters?" Karen's face went pale. After closing arguments, we were told to wait. The jury left, and I stepped outside to breathe. The sky was overcast, and the wind had picked up, but it felt good. Cleansing. I watched Luke chase a leaf down the walkway, laughing for the first time all day. That sound reminded me why I had done all of this, not for revenge. For safety, for peace, for every parent who needed someone to fight back when the system had turned into a bully. An hour later, we were called back in. The verdict was swift. The jury found the HOA negligent, Dobb personally responsible for child endangerment, and the board complicit through willful ignorance. Damages were awarded. A formal investigation into the HOA's entire conduct was ordered. And best of all, Karen was permanently barred from holding any position of authority in any homeowners association in the state. Doug was banned from community service roles and referred for criminal proceedings. I didn't cheer. I didn't clap. I just stood there with Luke's hand in mine and let the weight of it all settle over me. Justice had a sound to it. Not a bang, not a shout, just silence. The silence that comes when something heavy is finally set down. Outside, reporters tried to mob me, but I kept walking. I had nothing more to say. The evidence had spoken. The jury had listened. The fight was over, or at least this round was. Back home, I stepped into the garage and looked around. The octagon of justice felt different now. It was still a gym, still a refuge, but now it was something more, a monument. Proof that strength didn't always mean swinging fists. Sometimes it meant standing up, refusing to sit down, and forcing the world to look at what it didn't want to see. Luke climbed up onto one of the mats and posed like a mini champion. I laughed and joined him, lifting him into the air like a belt. He giggled and shouted, "Mom wins." And for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to believe it. We'd won. The air in the neighborhood felt different now, lighter somehow. The weight that had settled over everything for so long had finally lifted, like clouds clearing after a long, brutal storm. Neighbors who once kept their eyes down now waved when they walked past. Children played freely again, laughter returning to sidewalks that had once been silent under the HOA's watchful glare. Even the birds seemed louder, as if the trees themselves had decided to sing in celebration. The transformation didn't happen all at once, but it was unmistakable. Peace wasn't just possible now. It was present, tangible, real. The HOA board, as it had once existed, was gone. Following the verdict and the investigation it triggered, most members either resigned or were removed in disgrace. Karen's name became something whispered with embarrassment rather than fear. Her mansion at the corner of the block, once a symbol of smug authority, now stood empty, its blinds permanently shut, as if even the windows wanted nothing more to do with her. Dobb disappeared entirely. Rumors flew about where he had gone. Some said another state. Others said he'd been barred from working with the public ever again. I didn't care. Let him vanish. Let them all vanish. I wasn't chasing them anymore. I was building something better in their absence. Luke thrived. It didn't happen overnight, but every day he reclaimed another little piece of himself. He started drawing again, not just superheroes, but full cityscapes, robots, castles, and animals. His chalk art returned to the sidewalks, more vibrant and imaginative than ever. This time, nobody stopped him. One morning, I found a neighbor kneeling beside his newest creation, asking him what the characters meant. Luke explained with all the enthusiasm of a tiny director pitching a blockbuster. The neighbor clapped, then asked if Luke could draw something on their driveway too. By the end of the week, half the cul-de-sac was covered in color, turning concrete into a canvas. The same concrete that once held fear now held dragons and rocket ships. Justice didn't just restore, it reinvented. As for me, I kept the gym open. I wasn't charging, and I wasn't planning to. The octagon of justice became more than I expected. It became therapy, training ground, town hall, and sanctuary all at once. New people came weekly, some from down the street, others from towns over who'd heard what we'd done and wanted a piece of that strength for themselves. I taught basics, self-defense, confidence, breathing techniques, but I also just listened. Sometimes people didn't need to throw punches. They needed to be heard. One night, Ruth came in with her cane and asked if she could learn how to throw a proper right hook. I smiled and showed her. She hit the bag 5 times and then burst out laughing, the sound echoing off the walls louder than any punch. The mayor reached out not long after the trial, inviting me to speak at a community event about neighborhood rights and local leadership accountability. I turned it down politely. I didn't want a podium or a microphone. I didn't need applause. I needed people to realize they didn't have to wait for a hero to save them. Sometimes you just become your own. That was the message I carried, not through speeches but through presence, action, continuity. I stood where others had been knocked down. That was enough. Then came the special election to fill the HOA's leadership. Residents nominated me, of course, dozens of them. They said they trusted me, said I was the only one who stood up when nobody else would. I thanked them, but I declined. I didn't want power. I wanted freedom. Instead, I nominated someone else, Margaret, the retired librarian with a sharp tongue and a softer heart. She accepted, and the vote passed unanimously. Under her, the HOA transformed from a power-hungry council into a support-based committee. They created a new community code, written with input from actual residents. Fines were replaced with warnings. Disputes were mediated with empathy. Respect replaced regulation. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. A few weeks after the dust had settled, Luke came up to me with something behind his back. He was grinning, eyes bright with mischief. When I asked what he was hiding, he pulled out a tiny hand-drawn poster. At the top, in crooked but bold letters, it said, "Mom's Gym equals Hero School." Beneath it, he had drawn a cartoon version of me with boxing gloves and a cape, standing on top of a podium with the words, "No bullies allowed." I laughed so hard I cried, then hugged him until he squirmed to break free. That night, we hung it inside the gym, right above the heavy bag. It was better than any trophy. As the seasons changed, so did the landscape of the neighborhood. Things once forbidden flourished. Flags waved freely. Gnomes returned to lawns in whimsical defiance. Kids raced scooters down the street without fear of citations. There were still rules, yes, but now they protected instead of punished. And every so often, a new family would move in, asking cautiously about the HOA. The old residents would smile and say, "You're safe here now. We've got Tara." The final piece came unexpectedly. A package arrived with no return label. Inside was a pair of my old MMA gloves, worn but clean, with a note tucked inside that simply said, "You didn't quit. You evolved." I didn't recognize the handwriting. Maybe it was from an old fan. Maybe it was from someone I helped without realizing. It didn't matter. I placed the gloves on a shelf in the gym, right next to Luke's poster, the past and the future side by side. That weekend, we held a community event, not for politics or protest, but for play. A cookout, a chalk art contest, games, music. I grilled burgers while Luke ran around with his friends, his laughter louder than the speakers. Someone set up a karaoke machine. Ruth rapped badly. Tony danced surprisingly well. I stood at the edge of it all, taking it in, feeling the deep kind of peace that doesn't shout or demand attention. It just settles in and says, "This is how it should have always been." As the sun dipped below the rooftops and golden light bathed the street, I looked at the gym's wooden sign one last time. Someone had added a smaller one beneath it. Burned into the wood were the words, "Mess with the kid, meet the cage." It made me smile. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. A reminder that justice doesn't always wear a suit. Sometimes it wears gloves. And sometimes she answers to Mom.